Good evening and welcome to Conversations with T.D. Johnston and Mathieu Cailler. I'm Jane Addams, your very proficient host for this webinar this evening, brought to you by the 7th Annual Bluffton Book Festival. The people who bring you some of the best literature and the finest authors into your homes throughout the year. Tonight we have with us T.D. Johnston, who on my screen is on the upper left, and Mathieu Cailler, who's in the middle, lower middle. They're already very well-known authors for short story aficionados. They have garnered so very many awards between the two of them. And I'm going to brag on them for a minute. I have so many things to show you. I see some of them have some of their books up, but I'm going to show you full screen. This is Tim Johnston's book, Waiting for Eisenhower, his most recent short story volume. And this is his award-winning International Book Award winner of 2016, Friday Afternoon and Other Stories. From Mathieu, we have one of my favorites also, Los Angeles, which was a finalist for the International Book Award in 2015. Both of them, along with 33 other authors, appear in this, which is Short Story America's anthology, which is edited and published by T.D. Johnston. But both Mathieu and Tim appear, their stories appear in this, along with, as I said, 33 others. But tonight, what we're going to talk about is the fact that they have each come out this year with a debut novel. And I'm sure they have many more in the works. So first I'm going to show you Tim Johnston's, which is Reciprocity, a barn burner of a crime thriller. And it has already, I'm very proud to announce for Tim that it has been optioned recently by NBC Universal. And I apologize, Amazon hasn't gotten my copy yet of Mathieu Cailler's book, but I cannot wait to get it. It's called Heaven and Other Zip Codes. And it won the 2021 Los Angeles Book Festival Prize. Congratulations to both of you for all of your unbelievable awards and prizes. Matthew's book is about a series of anonymous letters that arrive in a family's mailbox, accusing one of them with infidelity. So that's going to be very juicy, and I find it a very enticing title as well. Okay, so both authors tonight, during their conversation, will be giving you a short taste of their books, just a 3-4 minute reading, just enough to whet your appetites, hopefully buy their books. So the audience, please do not forget, there's a Q&A section. I see some of you have found it on your screen. Don't forget to type in your questions, and we'll be opening up and reading some of those questions later if I can get some hearing, if I can get any volume here. We may have to just sort of wing this, and if I can't see or you can't hear me, I may open the Q&A box to you and you can pick your own questions. Okay, well, I'll turn this broadcast over now. I've taken entirely enough time. I think we're going to be quite safe going over and above our, it's already 7:30. So again, I apologize for the lost time, but we will go until 8:30. I think there'll be no problem at all. I will turn this over now to Tim Johnston and Mathieu Cailler.
Thank you so much. So delighted to be here. Thank you to Raquel, the Bluffton Book Festival, and to my good friend Tim. It's really great to be doing this with all of you, and thanks for dealing with the tech issues. Here we go. Yeah, Tim and I both came out with novels, and so we're both going to read a little bit first. Tim's going to go first and talk to you about his incredibly intense and thrilling Reciprocity, and then I'll do a reading and the two of us will chat a bit.
We sure will. I wouldn't, there's nobody I'd rather do this with, buddy. And I have
Likewise.
a lot of authors that I work with, nobody I'd rather do it with.
Oh, thank
So,
you. Likewise.
I believe that the festival wants us to read first. Since these are novels, we need a little bit of setup for what we're going to read. Reciprocity is a novel, for those who haven't read it, in which a secret cabal is killing city by city the mafia boss, Tony Soprano, John Gotti type person in each major city one by one. The novel essentially opens with the second and third of those hits. And 2 FBI agents, organized crime unit agents, have been assigned to lead the investigation. One is Jack Hanratty of Milwaukee, and one is Neville Parker of Chicago. What I'm going to read is a chapter about halfway through the novel in which, to set this up, Cosa Nostra, the mafia, is not pleased, as you might imagine, with what's going on, and especially with the fact that the media has dubbed these killers the Godfather assassins. And the mafia has brought a mercenary and his men over from Sicily, a very, very, very proficient hunter and killer. And his name is Fingo. And as Neville and Jack pursue the Godfather assassins, so does Fingo. Whereas where Jack and Neville want to arrest them, charge them, bring them to justice, big trial, that is not the mafia's goal. The mafia's goal is for them to pay deeply and never be seen again. That's Fingo's job. Fingo decides on a strategy of kidnapping the wife of Jack Hanratty. Her name is Rachel Hanratty. And I'm going to read you a passage that involves those 2 characters, Rachel Hanratty, who is now a captive of Fingo in a house under construction in rural Virginia. And I'll pick up there from her point of view, from Rachel Hanratty's point of view. The room was unfinished, like the previous room. The air she breathed was cold enough to create small moisture clouds in front of her face. Oddly, she didn't feel cold. She didn't know that a man named Travis Quill had died in this house, that the screams in her earlier nightmare had been his. But as she stared back at the pictures on the wall, she felt a queer sense of kinship with someone who had been here. Perhaps it was the figure under the bridge, so lonely. So as the abjectness of her own terror began to awaken from its slumber, she felt a parallel pity for someone. Jack would come. He would find her, just like in the movies. He would arrive at the last second and free her and kill that horrible creature, the man who had come into her room during the night and poured warm milk down her throat. The man who called himself Fingo had then put a spoonful of peanut butter into her mouth, peanut butter filled with God knows what. Fingo. Jack would find him. He and Neville would find him. They would get him. They would crush him, because there is a God. There is a God. There is a God. A voice inside her, one which had accompanied her throughout college, the voice which had for years always reminded her to read the newspaper and keep up with the world, spoke quietly but firmly to her mind about God. God might be great, and God might be good, my dear, but God likes to watch. Ask 6 million dead Jews how willing old Jehovah is to join in the fray. Ask thousands of dead Rwandans and Iraqis and Syrians or millions of dead Russians, what they did to deserve their awful fates. Ask them to bear witness to God's passivity, little girl. Chat with dead American slaves about 3 centuries of God's season tickets to the floggings, to the sweaty rapes of their daughters, to the wasting of generations of human lives in loving answer to swinging low, sweet chariots. Yes, my dear, God will be here for your immolation. He likes to watch. But she did believe in God. She had always rejected the nihilism which offered itself to her intellectually throughout her education. She had always hated the voice. And the part of her that hated the voice was the part of her that knew Jack would find her, because the Fingos of the world aren't supposed to win. Ah, but they do, my dear, but they do. Every minute of every day. It's why these Godfather assassins have chosen to become like the Fingos of the world. Fighting fire with fire is one of God's favorite sports to watch. He created so that he could be entertained. God relishes conflict, not the ultimate reign of goodness. If you doubt that, sweet girl, read your history books and study your current events. It was the longest speech the voice had ever made, or at least the longest she had listened to, and would have continued if not for the slow footsteps on the concrete floor in the hallway to her right. Her heart pounded. She tried to lift herself, but couldn't. She was too exhausted, she realized, and imagined that she sank back into her pillow. Fingo appeared in the doorway. He was alone. She considered screaming, but knew that her aloneness was total, immensely distant from the disinterested potential help watching television or playing on the computer in the nearest civilized dwelling. God likes to watch. Fingo leaned casually against the door jamb and laughed softly. What have you been thinking about, Mrs. Hanratty? I'd enjoy knowing. Hope fascinates me. The capacity for human beings to cling to it, and the capacity for human beings to abandon it. To cling or to abandon. Isn't that what life is all about, Mrs. Hanratty? Fingo disengaged himself from the door jamb and entered, rubbing his hands together as if gazing at the evening's repast. I asked you a question, Rachel. Isn't that what life is all about? Whether to cling or to abandon? God wants you to answer him, dear girl. It's part of the fun. You see, it's rather an historical question this man has put to you. Rachel did not answer. Somehow she knew, in a catch-22 kind of way, that attempts to appease, like attempts to joust, would only hasten this man's decisions. Last paragraph. I said that I asked you a question, Rachel. Silence then? I see. Well, perhaps you would like to talk about these photographs. Fingo stood stroking the picture of Jack with a tenderness that seemed sensual. Rachel turned her head to look out the window into the bleak, white world that lay so far away. If you think about it, whether to cling or to abandon is a question for all humanity, not just for you, and not just for the man in this picture, whom I require to abandon his duties in order to save your life. Hamlet's soliloquy might have substituted cling for to be, and abandon for not to be, for that is indeed the question before you today. And the reason that Fingo has taken her is that he is requiring of FBI agent Jack Hanratty that the Godfather assassins, when he finds them, be turned over to him. That's it.
Bravo, that was great. Loved hearing it in your voice, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I'll read just a short bit. Like Jane said, my novel is Heaven and Other Zip Codes. It follows four characters, a tutor, the tutor's, oh no, sorry, the tutor, a mother, the mother's boy, and the boy's stepfather. And it kind of rotates the point of view. And in short, it's about a tutor who gets a little too involved for the family for whom he works. You know, it's everything in life is far more complicated, but he takes a job and it starts to go one way. And before long, he's taking the boy out painting because he is a painter and he's trying to kind of, you know, have a different source of income and do some after school tutoring. And the mother sees that he's a talented painter and wants her boy to do a little bit of that. So this scene that I'm about to read is when the two start painting together in a beautiful rural area.
It's a great scene.
Thank you. I wonder why no one else paints here, Theo said. They're not as smart as us, Emerson said. Hey, have you ever been to Dominic's Steakhouse? No. Is it nice? They have girlfriend dishes, so that might be good for you, you know, to bring Carly. What do you mean girlfriend dishes? I don't know. Some of the things on the menu had GF written next to them. Things guys can order for their girlfriends, I guess. Emerson set his paintbrush down on his easel. I think that stands for gluten-free. Oh God, that makes so much more sense. I thought it was weird. I mean, girls love pasta and it wasn't picked as a GF item. After their laugh settled, the only sound that could be detected was the sigh of wind, and Emerson proceeded to paint the surroundings. Theo, Emerson said in a whisper, being really serious right now. Do not move. What? Do not move, Emerson said. Listen to me. Trust me. Emerson stared hard at a spot a few feet behind Theo, coercing the boy to line his eyes with the dusty rattlesnake, whose split tongue licked the air. Be still, he said again. The snake, however, disregarded the instructions, inching its way closer to Theo, its rattle now up and shaking. Theo quivered. Mr. Toffler, he said, his right Nike slipping loose. And just that, the sound of rubber against earth startled the snake. It struck at once, a flash from the ground, its mouth wide, fangs plunging into Theo's calf. Shit, Emerson yelled, as the snake slithered into a patch of tall grass. The rattle stopped, but Emerson still heard the sound in his ears. Emerson knew panic wouldn't help, but his insides were knotted. Task and then another task. He needed to view everything as step by step, get Theo to the car, take him to the hospital. Lucky for Emerson, Theo was light, so Emerson flung the boy over his shoulder before tearing up the hillside to his car. His legs churned and prickled. Even though life was more important than usual, the tick of seconds he found possessed a slow motion quality, and his actions were deliberate. Keep talking to me, Emerson said. How are you feeling? He said, dropping the boy into the passenger seat. Before he knew it, he whipped the car around and peeled onto the main road. The hospital isn't far, Emerson said. Not far at all. Not far at all. He ripped the shifter back and the engine growled behind him as he zoomed past cars over double yellow lines. Am I going to die? Theo asked. Is this the kind of thing that kills people or just deforms them? Emerson ground gears and downshifted into second around a tight bend. Color drained from the boy's face. You're not going to die. What are they going to do to me at the hospital? I don't know. It's getting really big. Look. Emerson pummeled his horn, then darted through a stop sign after scanning the traffic. Hey, Mr. Toffler, Theo said. If I do die, can you tell my mom that I love her? Emerson honked again. Sure, buddy. And the boy added, his voice low, can you tell yourself that I love you too? Even with the RPMs high, Emerson heard the boy's sniffles. So he reached over and cupped Theo's head, feeling his soft hair against his palm. He let the words hang in the car's cabin, careful not to say something that would scare them away. Thank you.
I love your novel, man.
Wonderful, wonderful. And
Thanks so
so
much.
now Matthew and Timothy are going to have a nice little conversation with each other since I cannot hear you.
Oh my.
I'm the
Great
only
job.
one who cannot
Thank
hear.
you.
So I'm going to take a look at the questions and answers, but I'm
Sure.
sure you have some for each other before I
Yeah.
go and figure out how we're going to go to the audience's questions. So
Well,
you guys have known each other a long, long time, I know.
in a way,
Collaborated.
in a way,
Yeah,
this will
sure,
probably
thank you.
repeat. In a way, this will probably repeat portions of previous conversations
Absolutely.
that Matt and I have had. We read all of each other's work. We admire each other's work, and we like to talk about what goes into it and why we do it.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is we both have a very similar journey. I think what we love is definitely the short form, the short story, something that can be read in a single sitting. And it's interesting that we met in 2012 at the Short Story America Festival, celebration of short fiction. And then around the same time, our novels released. So we kind of made a similar, I don't know if you want to call it evolution, jump, whatever you want to call it, but how did that, for you, how did short fiction kind of influence your novel? How do you feel like coming from short fiction kind of played with the longer form?
That is a great question, and I have the same for you because I think that being short story writers are much of our adult lives, and then moving to the novel. I mean, I'm moving to it way later in life than you are, but relative to the years I've spent writing short stories, about the same as you. And I envy you for getting to novels in your mid to late 30s, because I did not. I find that there is a quote from John Edgar Wideman that I think applies to both short fiction and good novels.
Yeah, come on in, because I can't hear a thing.
And I'm gonna read this to you because I think I came home to this philosophy about good writing as a short story writer, and then I've pulled it into writing novels. This is from Weidman. Good writing is always about things that are important to you, things that are scary to you, things that eat you up.
Mm.
And I can't think of a short story that I've written that does not connect with that quote, even though I first saw that quote maybe 6 months ago. But it is, for me, that is just spot on. That's where I've always come from with short fiction. So in moving to the novel, it really was the same thing. And what helped me to get started was the decision that I would write my novel in short chapters with sort of singular effect endings to each chapter to drive the reader to the next chapter in a way I think that good short story writers are probably well equipped to do. I mean, you look at a guy like F. Scott Fitzgerald, he came from short stories. And is there a novel that moves you chapter to chapter better than Gatsby? I'm not sure there is. That was a novel by a short story writer, written with a short story writer's sensibility for the hook, for tension, and for a total lack of waste.
Yeah.
How about you, Matt?
Yeah, it's so intriguing. I agree with, we both did something similar structurally, where you have actual chapters. I have my book laid out in like basically a school month academic calendar. So
Right.
my big chapters are like, just the months, but within the months, it rotates the point of view. And I tried to keep it like almost like in a math equation, about 1,500 words per character. So you hear 1,500 words, and I wanted everyone to have kind of the same airtime,
Right.
I remember thinking, I don't want one character to have the most say in the novel and then the other one's lesser. So I did kind of do the same thing, and I always tried to have some sort of quick takeoff. I have a quote that I love from David Joss, a fiction professor at Vermont College, who said, the novel is, what did he say? The novel, it kind of takes off like an airplane where you have a runway, and the short story is a helicopter. You just have to kind of get it in the air.
The other thing,
And I tried to do like as much helicoptering as I could per section,
yeah,
does have to be some sort of build up and character development. But once we were once we were in there, I wanted it to be as quick takeoff and then kind of the next one. So you're just constantly wanting to see what's going to happen with these
Yeah.
characters. You know, this novel kind of was born out of a short story. I never sat down and said, okay, it's time for a novel. I wrote a really bad short story called Homework, and I couldn't figure out why it was A, really long, B, it was like 54 pages or something, which is a weird length for a short story. And I remember going like, oh, it's just unlike, I can't seem to tame this beast, you know? And I was looking at it, and I had a friend at the time read it, or a dear friend read it, who I was going to school with, and he said, oh yeah, I kind of see what you did. I think you wrote a novel in 54 pages. That's why you don't like it. And I said, oh, that is it. Like, that's exactly what, you know, he's either like, you want to tighten this, or, you know, it's just, there's too much for the container.
Give it
So-
more life, give it more oxygen.
And at the time, it was only from Theo's point of view, the whole short story.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I was then like, well, I kind of want to know more about Emerson. So maybe they can split it, and or Mr. Toffler, as Theo calls him. And then, well, I kind of want to know more about the mom. And the novel just kind of opened up for me when I said, oh, what if I have all four of them tell their story? And,
Yeah.
you know, much
and
details.
and you drove your plot that way, and that's how I actually had to do it with Reciprocity, because there are a lot of characters in a lot of different places, and there is going to be a convergence. It makes me think, oh gosh, if you've ever read Eye of the Needle by Ken Follett, or maybe The Man from St. Petersburg by Ken Follett, to bring those stories home meant involving a lot of characters, and with a third person anonymous narrator, having to have a narrative point of view chapter by chapter with different people, different vital people, but people who are part of the story, and the only way to tell the whole story is to be with them in the moment. Yeah. And that's how I did it with Reciprocity. Yeah, that was necessary for mine. In your case, it wasn't necessary, but it was the best choice that you could possibly have made. Because in reading your novel, seeing things all the time, you know, on a very fair rotation, you didn't favor anyone in terms of time. Hoyt, the antagonist, gets as much airtime in your novel as Theo and Circe. You know, it was really, really, really well done in that regard, and the right decision. It helps to make the novel work.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love the topic of point of view, narrative point of view, because the menu is so big. It's such a broad menu, but the decision about narrative point of view is one of the most vital decisions an author makes, for a short story or for a novel.
Absolutely. And switching it up, whether it's your book or kind of, we did similar things. It makes you have a deeper understanding of the characters, which is so needed for the conflict in your book, the conflict in my book, you know. Did you have trouble, because it is interesting, we're like really in love with the short form where your conflict is kind of right up front. Did you have trouble kind of stretching out conflict and having multiple conflicts like in your novel, or how did that go for you?
Not really, but partly because I knew it was essential for this novel. If you're going to write this novel with this story, with this synopsis on the back cover, well, then you'd better sustain conflict or its potential. Tension's necessary. The potential for conflict ongoing. It's obvious in a story about some regular human beings killing mafia bosses, committing serial murder, capital murder, and you are wanting the reader to be rooting for them committing these crimes. There has to be conflict. There has to be strong characterization. You know, people have to get to know these people on both sides. But I'm also a big believer in the early hook, and that definitely comes from writing short stories. Would you agree with that? And, you know,
absolutely.
That prioritizing an early hook which now my agent has my next 2 novels in hand, and is starting to shop those. It's the same prioritization of the early hook. I like an early hook as a reader, and I like an early hook as a short story writer. So I've brought that to my novels.
You did.
Let's fling the door open and not just say walk on in to the reader, but grab them by the scruff of the neck and yank them in.
Yeah.
Is kind of how I find that I like writing novels.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, mine was different in the sense that there was a lot. It felt a little similar to some of my short stories where there's trouble kind of boiling under the surface, but there were no big like peaks. You know, if it was an EKG, it was kind of like, I wanted it to be slow in terms of a raising of your blood pressure, so to speak.
For your story,
Yeah,
that's how it had to be.
I think that makes me feel good that you say so.
Well, no, I mean, these are decisions. You know,
Yeah.
if I were, I haven't yet, but if I were writing a novel that is way more relationship based, way more intimate with fewer characters, I would absolutely take the approach that you took with Heaven and Others.
It makes me feel good. Yeah, it's true. It's true that every piece of writing, you know, poetry, a poem or a short story or any novel, it's its own little ecosystem, you know, and there are kind of some steadfast rules that writers try to follow, but all in all, it really is, it's like some sort of, well, you know, what is the best for this particular situation? It might not kind of translate to something else, you know, and yeah, and it felt organic. Once I found those 4 voices, the book was written in a couple months. You know, that was kind of what the short story, the bad short story took me 3 months. The novel took me 2 months, just because once I had 4 people, I said, okay, let's do this.
By that time, you knew each of your characters intimately.
Yeah.
I forget what writer said it, but the job of the writer, you're constructing human souls.
Yeah.
I think it might have been Ortega Gasset, I'm not sure. But you're constructing human souls. Once you had done that with those 4 people, Emerson, Theo, Circe, Hoyt, and Hoyt not being the good guy, and you knew them so intimately, you had created those human souls. They exist now. You can't put them in a shoebox anymore. They exist now. They have life. And then you stay loyal to who they are in writing them, including in their dialogue.
I would agree. Did you have trouble writing really intense villains like a Fingo? How was that for you?
Well, that goes back to the Weidman quote. I'll read it one more time real quick. Good writing is always about things that are important to you, things that are scary to you,
Yeah.
things that eat you up. Fingo is scary to me. And he certainly isn't me. But somewhere along the way as a short story writer, I did develop the ability to step into that person's shell and become that person, even if I didn't like that person. In Friday Afternoon, I didn't like Bryce Stanford, but I'm in his head the entire story. For anyone who's read Friday Afternoon, I didn't like him. He's a remarkably dismissive guy, but I knew him really well, and so I can write an evil character by going ahead and saying and thinking the things that I imagine that they do, think, and say. And whether they say it or do it to intimidate, I understand that why they want to intimidate. They say or do something because they have some degree of extreme cruelty or even sadism. That's abhorrent to me, but that's who Fingo is. And so I could write him because by then he exists. He's another human soul that we've constructed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is intriguing too, coming from short fiction, where you are constantly generating characters, right? There's like, you have in a short story collection, you might have some 40 characters you've really spent an
Yeah.
incredible amount of time with. So you're jumping around sometimes, different genders, different ages, different whatever it is, and you are familiar with what that process is like. I know I had a lot of reps, I felt like, for when I was creating for people, it ended up feeling like, oh, I get to spend a significant amount of time with them.
Yeah, and you get to spend as much time with them as you like. It's why this is very hard work that we do, yes. And I read writers talking about how hard the work is. But I look forward to it immensely every time I sit down to do it. I really look forward to working that hard. And I think one reason is most of what I write, I'm writing in order to find out what happens. Which takes us in process to the topic of outlining.
Mm-hmm.
I don't outline. I've never outlined a short story, and I haven't outlined a novel. And here this novel is, Universal's optioned it. I made it up as I went along, as I created characters. I believe as a short story writer, and therefore also as a novelist, that I'm creating a situation that has potential for early tension, potential for sustained tension, conflict. I'm going to get to know the people who come into this story very, very well so that I can write them. And then the suspense for me as a writer is the same as it is for the reader. I'm writing the rest of the story or the rest of the novel to find out what happens. And I know, every writer is different, and everybody should be true to who they are as a reader, thinker, writer. That of course there are writers who say, oh no, I choose the discipline involved in developing an outline, whether that involves some level of storyboarding, whatever. And for those writers, that works. But for me, it won't. Maybe for the same reason that as an English major at Davidson College, I didn't outline essays, even though I was told to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I sometimes have a general idea, but I do like to keep myself. I think the problem with a really kind of, restrictive outline is that you don't surprise yourself. And if you don't surprise yourself, chances are you're not surprising the reader. And so that can be dangerous, Once you get to a certain level in your story, you say, okay, well, now I kind of know my plot points. I've told myself the story. Let's see if I can inject some suspense or what have you along the way and go back. But I agree with you. Staying open and trusting, trusting the whole process, having it be a little scary is good. I'm still very terrified to write most mornings. It's anxiety, but it's, what's that?
What'd you say? I'm sorry.
I'm still a little terrified to write many mornings. Like, it's a good, healthy anxiety. I think of Bill Russell, the basketball player who recently passed the all-time championship. With most championships, I think he had 11 and 13 seasons. And I think I've told this story to Sophronia and was here today, but I read this book about him a long time ago about how he was so nervous before games that he always threw up. And he was pumped up, and he did it, when he was at San Francisco, at the university level, all the way through the pros. And he was just, and when there were certain games where he didn't throw up, and his teammates would make him go back in the locker room to throw up because they thought
they knew it worked, right? Yes.
You just think all right, well, it wasn't fear that he had, it was an excitement and energy, and I don't want to lose it really, but I think that's where I am, where it still brings a good amount of trepidation, anxiety. I don't know what's going to happen. And I think, if that were to go away, I don't know if I would be so excited to write anymore. There's something that kind of gets your juices. Yeah.
Well, Stephen King, probably at least half of us that are involved in this conversation or audience right now may have read his book on writing. But that when it comes to starting a writing project, and we have a couple people on the list I'm looking at who I know are getting ready to start, who haven't done it before, who haven't written fiction before.
Mhm.
I can identify them, but I see them on the list here. And a good thing that we all have to remind ourselves is that if Stephen King says this, then we all should. That's what I think. The scariest moment is always just before you start. As a writer, you're creating something that has never happened in the world. You're creating characters that have never existed, human souls that have never existed. That's terrifying. It's like, it's my job to do all that creation. What am I, God?
Mhm.
I'm not. But I am a guy sitting at a computer who's going to be like God for the next 400 pages or 12 pages of a short story. And the scariest moment is always just before you start. And so I tell people, just start. Just start. Just throw it on there.
Mhm.
Circle back in 2 days and say this stinks, or you can say, oh, this is off to a good beginning.
Sure.
And then
Yeah.
you build, and then you build. There's another note I put down for tonight is from Hemingway. Prose is architecture, not interior decoration. And that whatever you put to the page should be building your story. It should play a role in building your story. That's architecture. Description is important, but it's not as important as building the story. Description can help build the story, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all. And I think you're like I am. You will describe when it's important to describe, whether it's characters, whether it's the inside of a room, whether it's a park, whether it's a beach, but you will leave it alone when it's not important to do it. Sometimes you leave it up to the reader to decide for himself what this character looks like that just walked into the room, maybe based on the reaction of the person who's already in the room.
Sure.
There's nuance there, but I've always liked that quote from Hemingway.
Yeah, I love that. I've never heard it before, actually, so I love that.
Yeah.
With your recent option with Universal, when you were writing this reciprocity, there definitely is. When I've read it 3 times now, which is kind of fun. Like I read it as an early blurber, but it wasn't exactly in its final form. Then I read it when it first came out because I was excited to see what you did.
You read an early draft as a book.
Yeah, and now it's very exciting to see kind of there was always such great cinematic potential. When you were writing this, you probably weren't going like, okay, here comes Universal and rubbing your hands together, but I'm sure you've always had in all your work, from Friday Afternoon to The Errand to so many great stories, you always had a real cinematic quality to your writing. What do you attribute that to?
Dan Conover, Dan's not here, is he? I know we lost some people tonight, but Dan Conover, who wrote a review for, I think it was Island News, of Reciprocity. He's the former city editor at the Charleston Post and Courier, and he is a 6-novel author now and writes trilogies. And he's going to be one of the presenters at the Short Story America conference. Dan called me about the novel first and raved about it and said, he said, there are 107 chapters in this book. It's 484 pages. He said, you wrote this in scenes, didn't you? And I'm sitting there on the phone, and it hadn't occurred to me that I'd written 107 scenes, which is the cinematic term. But then it did occur to me, I said, yes, I saw this play out like a movie
Mhm.
as I wrote it. And literally wrote it that way, even if it wasn't consciously at the time. It's more conscious now with what I'm writing right now. Right now, I'm writing the sequel to Reciprocity. My agent said, you've got to write the sequel because Universal's optioned it as a television series for streaming, for Netflix or Amazon Prime or whoever it ends up being. And this isn't a spoiler to anyone who hasn't read Reciprocity, but the end of Reciprocity, it can continue or it can be over. At the end of the book, it's really up to the reader. But once I write the sequel, then it's not up to the reader. And once Universal does whatever they're doing, but I'm doing that right now. I'm 80 pages into the sequel to Reciprocity, and it is a continuation. And I think now I'm a little bit more conscious, more overtly conscious of writing the novel in scenes as opposed to calling them chapters. And that came from Dan Conover, observing that.
I am going to have to stop, interrupt you. And can you hear that feedback?
A little bit.
A little bit, okay. But it is time to give you some questions
Perfect.
that the audience is
Excellent.
called in. Okay. This one's for Matthew. And it says, what inspiration, Matthew, did you draw when you wrote your novel?
Oh, that's a great question. Is that from Carl? Oh, hey, Carl. So nice.
Oh, yes, it is, Carl. I
Oh,
wasn't
thank
going
you,
to.
Carl. Oh, it's so cool that he's here. That's a great question. And it's this one's an intriguing one for me because a lot of the stories I write are like very much fiction based. And I mean that in the sense that I come up with an idea for something, but I've sometimes never experienced this or never been there, but I've, had similar emotions. And there's a lot of basically fate quality to it. But this one kind of fell in my lap. I was like Emerson, trying to support myself as a writer, which is difficult. And I was a full-time teacher for a while, but it became a little difficult to write while being a full-time teacher. So I wanted to still teach. I really enjoy it. So I decided to start my own educational therapy business and do a lot of like tutoring at people's homes or SAT for things of that nature, and some small groups. And so I started working, I was probably in my mid-20s. I started working with this very tender boy who was soulful and wise. And just being a teacher, I've worked with a lot of kids like that. And this guy, he felt like, just like he had the soul of like an 80-year-old man who had been through a lot of things. And he spoke so openly to me, and we developed a really beautiful bond. And his father wasn't around a lot. He was on business. And so he kind of looked to me for guidance, and I kind of loved it. And one day he just jokingly said, wouldn't it be cool if we ran away together? Like me, you, and my mom, because they had me over for chili one day after I finished tutoring. It was really late at night.
Wow.
It was just this really sweet thing, and we just laughed, and the room fell still. And it was one of those things where I laughed, we kind of just laughed it off, and we're like, oh, that would be funny. And then, about a few months later, the father was transferred and they moved to New York. And, I still kept in touch here and there with the boy. But I remember just that line resonating with me, kind of poking me and saying like, that, wouldn't it be if we ran away together? I thought about it and I thought about it, and it just needled me. And that happened.
Oh my God, yeah. And with
I said,
every
one day I got to turn this into something, and that's what fiction to me.
Yes.
Fiction is like the what if, like if you go for it, right? If you cross that bridge. Real life, we're far more cautious. We avoid conflict. We don't want to yell at someone in the supermarket, so we go over here. Fiction, you kind of do everything you're not supposed to do. So I decided to just go for it. I felt comfy doing it in a short story form, and then it evolved. So thank you, Carl.
I didn't know about that boy in your real life, but
yeah,
definitely succeeded in creating Theo coming from that boy.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah,
That voice saying that to you is entirely consistent with Theo's character.
oh, good. Yeah, it was a really, like a very beautiful short-lived bond. I taught that boy for only 8 months before he left town. And I just remembered going like, that kid's gonna be okay. He has such a soul, he would be playing chess by himself. One-on-one chess with no other person there after school and trying to come up with. He was a very analog kid in a very digital world, which was kind of charming.
But then as a fiction writer, you did the extrapolation.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to kind of play around with all sorts of characters. I actually didn't know his mother that well. But I kind of had to fill in the blanks, and it just became a lot of fun to do that. So yeah. Thank you, Carl. Great question.
Good question from Carl. We have another one from Carl. And I remind other people, we don't have that much longer. So type in your questions if you have some. This one also from Carl is for Tim. It says, how engaged did you become in getting into the mind of the character Fingo? I think we all want to know that.
Hey, well, Carl, I think I just accepted a Facebook request from you a couple days ago. It sounds like you've read the novel, and I'm honored that you have. So can you rephrase that again for me, Jane?
It says, how engaged did you become in getting into the mind of the character Fingo? And then there's a corollary to it. Specifically, my question refers to the understanding of the psyche of an ace hitman.
People who know me well and see what things I tend to wax about on Facebook and whatnot, know that I look at cruelty with a capital C as something that to many people is a religion, with all of its different levels and gradations and nuances. Cruelty is one of our country's religions. And Fingo, coming from another country in service of and for money, but coming from Sicily in service of La Cosa Nostra, the mafia in America, I wanted him to be almost cartoonishly evil. And some people say, well, don't write a character who's cartoonishly evil. Well, please tell that to Ian Fleming. I mean, James Bond is loaded with cartoonishly evil antagonists. I was interested in him being naturally cruel, taking his natural cruelty to its ultimate limit, working its way into how he talks, how he seeks to intimidate through dialogue, through what he says to people, into his history. There's a chapter where I do develop his history from childhood. But I wanted him to be entirely about cruelty. That's what he derived joy from. And in the end, I wanted that to be something really, really present in the reader's mind about him. The world has people like Fingo in it. And that's a scary thing. And some of them are people who have more power than he does. And I think fiction writers should go there sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. If the audience would hold up their hands, the answer to this question, I wanted to know from the readers, I'm assuming that some of you have read one or both of the books. Did you discern that both of these writers came from a short story tradition? Anybody hands? Carl, Lex. Okay. Anybody else? That's just those two. Okay. And Sophronia has. Okay. Oh, now they're all starting to. Okay. Ryan. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's see. I'm going to pick on somebody. Sophronia. I'm going to allow you to talk for a minute. Okay, Sophronia,
Okay,
tell us about
okay.
how you could tell they were short story writers initially, primarily, originally.
Well, Tim used the word scene, right? And short stories are really scene based, right? You have to, they are compact and
Yeah.
they have to be complete. And that means you have to have a scene, right? You have to have the location, the people talking, it's hugely visual, and it's a very tight structure, right? So that's evident, right? In novels where there isn't a writer with a short story background, you have chapters that kind of go on forever and ever, or
I
something
agree with you.
might
Yeah.
happen, right? The chapters where you
Yeah.
have something
Yeah.
that happen. And with
I-
story writers, the chapters tend to be complete almost in and of themselves.
Yeah. I do love both of these writers for that reason. They are fast paced. They don't waste any words. And it is succinct and the story is just moves along. They're just hard to put down. Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Carl? No? Okay. All right. If anybody else would like to ask another question, now would be the time.
I think we have a few in there now, don't we?
Do we have some?
I think so. I saw the number move up anyway.
All right, let's open some more. See if I can see something. Looks like 8 have opened.
If not, there was one more thing Matt and I were going to talk about.
Oh, okay. We've got a couple minutes, but then I'm going to have to sign us off.
Sure. Matt, we were talking a couple days ago about music in process and our different approaches to music, and also where they were the same. They were, turned out that, well, go ahead and say what your approach is to using music in process.
Yeah, it's funny because you asked me, do you listen to music when you write? And I said no, which is true. I need like a really thick quiet, right? I usually sit in a quiet room and wear noise canceling headphones. So I try to stay in as much of a dream space as possible and just very quiet. However, then we started kind of discussing it further, and I said to you that I often listen to a song a lot while I'm writing a story, that I feel like it hits the mood, and so I was telling you when I wrote the story Over the Bridge in Los Angeles that I was obsessed with Miles Davis's Blue and Green. I listened to that song probably like 20 times a day, just because there was something about it where it fit. The father was a sax player, so there's a little bit of a jazz correlation, but it wasn't even that as much as just the mood. I wanted to kind of bring that over, and the thing I'm writing right now, it's Bob Dylan's Me in the Morning, and sometimes I just feel like the overall kind of atmospheric melody is what I need to make my piece sound like, so that was interesting. I had never really thought about it before, and then
that was why literally 2 minutes after we hung up the phone, I sent you the song "We Have All the Time in the World," sung by Louis Armstrong, written by John Barry for a James Bond movie, and such an incredibly beautiful song about love. But that song for me was what I was conjuring in my head as I read the ending of your novel.
That's beautiful.
That song by Louis Armstrong. And if any of you have never listened to it, it's "We Have All the Time in the World," sung by Louis Armstrong, written by John Barry. Incredible. And I was telling Matt, I only write fiction with music. AirPods. I have a writing playlist that continues to grow of what I put on a shuffle, never the same order, when I write fiction. And often I will go and find something in particular for a particular mood. A couple of times, for example, when I have written the dying process for a character that I care about, I have chosen to be listening to Pink Floyd's Great Gig in the Sky.
Mm.
I've done that more than once. I did that in, oh no, I need to not do a spoiler on Reciprocity. I was about to spoil it. Somebody I care about dies, but I'm not going to tell you who. But I deliberately put on Pink Floyd's Great Gig in the Sky because I knew it would put me into that dream state that Matt just mentioned, that would allow me to write that scene in the best possible way.
Yeah.
Yeah, music. I love music passionately to begin with, and it is very much a part of my process. And everybody's different, just like some people outline, and I never ever do. You have to be true to yourself, and I can't write fiction without music.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to have to regrettably say that this evening is over for this time. Two final notes. Tim, the publisher of Short Story America, 7 volumes now, is presenting a wonderful, both Tim and Matthew will appear live in Beaufort, South Carolina, November 4th, 5th, and 6th. A number of us who love writing and reading will be there. Again, that's November 4th, 5th, and 6th. Matthew will be a presenter, and I look forward to hearing that.
Oh, good. Thank you, Jane.
Details and tickets still available, a couple of them, there it is, at shortstoryamerica.com.
Right.
And last but not least, don't forget Bluffton Book Festival's next virtual event, which will occur on Thursday, November 17th, in conjunction with the Pat Conroy Literary Center. Those tickets are available on BlufftonBookFestival.com. Thank you all, to the audience and to our wonderful authors tonight for being with us. Sorry about those problems, but it won't happen next time.
That was very good. Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much, Jane. Thank you so much, Matt.
Absolutely.
It was a blast as always.
Great job, Tim.
Everyone.
Thank you,
And
Jane.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everybody.